Think about a teenager sitting at a kitchen table, staring blankly into the middle distance while their parent asks a simple question. There is no shouting, no dramatic door slamming, and no visible anger. There is just a heavy, rhythmic exhale. It is that specific sigh of profound, localized boredom that every parent recognizes and every teenager has perfected. It is the sound of a person who feels entirely too large for the room they are currently standing in. We usually look at that sigh as a modern symptom of a pampered world, something born from the friction of school schedules and social media anxiety. But if you could pull back the curtain of time and look at a campfire 40,000 years ago, you would hear that exact same sound. You would see a young man or woman looking at their elders with that same simmering impatience, feeling that same biological pressure to be somewhere else, doing something dangerous, with people their own age. That sigh isn't a product of the 21st century. It is an ancient, biological alarm clock telling the human species it is time to move. For a long time, we assumed that adolescence was a relatively new invention, a luxury of the modern world where we have the time to let children slowly transition into adulthood. The popular theory was that in the ancient world, you were a child until you were about 12, and then you were a productive, working adult until you died. But the more we look at the actual evidence, the more we realize that the reckless teenager is not a bug in our history, but a very intentional feature. It turns out that ancient humans didn't just have teenagers, they relied on them. They needed that specific, volatile mix of physical strength and questionable judgment to survive as a species. The tension we feel in a modern household is just the leftover static from a time when that tension was the only thing keeping the tribe from stagnating. The question is, how did a group of people living on the absolute edge of survival manage to tolerate a demographic that is famous for taking unnecessary risks and ignoring instructions? But if the behavior was truly a threat to the group, why didn't evolution simply smooth it out and make teenagers more compliant? To understand why a reckless teenager wasn't just a nuisance but a necessity, we have to look at the hardware they are working with. We often talk about the teenage brain as if it is a half-finished version of an adult brain. But neuroscientists like Sarah Jane Blakemore have shown that it is actually a highly specialized tool. During these years, the brain goes through a process called synaptic pruning. It is essentially an aggressive internal renovation where the brain sheds the connections it isn't using to make the ones it does use more efficient. But this renovation doesn't happen all at once. The part of the brain responsible for seeking rewards and social connection, the limbic system, matures quite early. It is like a high-performance engine that is ready to roar. Meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that handles impulse control, long-term planning, and weighing consequences, doesn't fully finish its development until a person is in their mid-20s. It is the brain's braking system, and it is still being installed while the engine is already redlining. In a modern setting, having a powerful engine and no brakes is a recipe for a car crash or a bad decision on a Saturday night. But in the Upper Paleolithic, this was a survival strategy. Think about the environment our ancestors lived in. If you were too cautious, you didn't eat. If you were too afraid to leave the valley your parents grew up in, your group eventually ran out of resources or became inbred. You needed a segment of the population that was biologically incapable of feeling the full weight of fear. You needed people who were dopamine-driven, who felt a massive surge of pleasure from trying something new or succeeding at a difficult task. When a teenager today gets a rush from a viral video, they are using the same neural circuitry that an ancient teenager used when they decided to track a cave lion just to see where it lived. The recklessness we see is actually a highly evolved drive for exploration and discovery. Without that period of life where the gas pedal is floored, humans probably would have stayed in Africa and never bothered to see what was on the other side of the horizon. But if the brain was intentionally wired to be a little bit out of control, who exactly was left to deal with the wreckage when things went wrong? This is where the concept of parent-offspring conflict comes into play, a theory famously formalized by the evolutionary biologist Robert Trivers in 1974. Trivers pointed out something that seems obvious now but was revolutionary at the time. Parents and children do not have identical evolutionary interests. A parent wants to ensure the survival of all their children, which means they want each child to be cautious, to share resources, and to stay close to the safety of the group. The child, however, wants to maximize their own fitness, which often means taking risks to secure a high status or finding a mate from a different group. This creates a biological tug-of-war. In the ancient world, this wasn't just about arguing over chores, it was a literal battle over the direction of the species. Parents were the stabilizers, the ones holding the collective memory of what had killed people in the past. Teenagers were the innovators, the ones willing to bet their lives that there was a better way to do things. Every time an ancient teenager pushed back against an elder's advice, they were testing the boundaries of the group's knowledge. If the elder said, "Don't go near the river at night because of the spirits," and the teenager went anyway and came back with a basket of fish, the group's survival strategy just evolved. Of course, sometimes the teenager didn't come back, and that was the price the species paid for progress. This friction was the engine of human adaptation. It forced the elders to justify their rules and forced the young to prove their competence. It is a stressful, exhausting dynamic for everyone involved, but it prevents a culture from becoming a dead end. We see this today in the way teenagers are the first to adopt new technology or social norms. They are still our primary scouts, venturing into the new and reporting back on whether it is safe or useful. But if the conflict was inevitable, how did these families manage to stay together when the stakes involved actual survival? The answer is buried in the bones. Archaeologists like Jennifer French and Mary Lewis have spent years looking at the skeletal remains of Upper Paleolithic humans to find evidence of this adolescent transition. By looking at things like dental development and the fusion of bone plates, they can tell how old a person was when they died and what kind of physical stress they were under. What they found is fascinating. Ancient humans had a clear, distinct adolescent growth spurt, much like we do today. This means that for a period of several years, these individuals were physically as large and strong as adults, but their bones were still maturing. They were in a state of, almost, a biological middle ground. We also see evidence that these teenagers were not just passive members of the tribe. In sites like Sungir in Russia, which dates back about 34,000 years, we find teenagers buried with incredible gravity and care. One famous burial contains two adolescents, a boy and a girl, buried head-to-head with thousands of ivory beads, spears, and carved art. These elaborate burials tell us that teenagers weren't just seen as kids who hadn't grown up yet. They were valued, perhaps even revered, members of the community. They were clearly doing work that mattered. They were hunting, they were creating art, and they were likely involved in the spiritual life of the group. But the bones also show the cost. Many adolescent remains show signs of healed fractures or injuries consistent with high-risk activities. They were the ones taking the brunt of the physical danger. While the children stayed near the camp and the older adults managed the long-term strategy, the teenagers were the shock troops of the ancient world. They were the ones out on the perimeter, the ones testing the thin ice, the ones engaging with rival groups. They were dangerous to the status quo, certainly, but they were the shield that protected everyone else. But seeing the bones is one thing. How do we know what these young people were actually doing with that newfound energy? To find that answer, we have to look at the way teenagers behave in groups. There is a famous study in modern psychology where researchers put teenagers in a driving simulator. When the teenagers were alone, they took roughly the same number of risks as adults. They were perfectly capable of being safe. But the moment you put two of their friends in the room to watch them, the risk-taking behavior skyrocketed. Their brains became hypersensitized to the potential for social reward. In the ancient world, this peer effect was a vital social adhesive. Between the ages of 13 and 19, your brain is essentially being rewired to value the opinions of your peers more than the opinions of your parents. This feels like a betrayal to a parent, but it is actually a brilliant evolutionary move. Your parents are eventually going to die. Your peer group is the cohort you will have to hunt with, defend the camp with, and raise children with for the next 40 years. By making teenagers reckless in front of each other, evolution ensured that they would form deep, intense bonds forged in high-stakes situations. An ancient teenager who took a risk and succeeded gained the trust and admiration of the people they would rely on for the rest of their life. They were building a social bank account. This is why teenagers today are so obsessed with social media and peer approval. They are following an ancient script that says, your survival depends on your status within your age group. In the Upper Paleolithic, being a loner wasn't an edgy lifestyle choice. It was a death sentence. You needed to be part of the team, and the fastest way to prove your worth to the team was to show that you were brave, capable, and willing to take risks for the benefit of the group. The danger they posed to the group's safety was offset by the incredible social cohesion they created. If risk was a requirement for the group's future, how did they stop a single impulsive teenager from burning the whole system down? Ancient societies dealt with this danger through the use of highly structured rites of passage. In almost every traditional culture studied by anthropologists, there is a clear, often painful, and always intense ceremony that marks the end of childhood and the beginning of adulthood. These weren't just parties, they were psychological software updates. They often involved isolation, physical endurance tests, or the learning of secret tribal knowledge. These rituals served a very specific purpose. They channeled the teenage drive for risk into a controlled environment. The elders were essentially saying, we know you want to prove yourself. We know you want to take risks. Here is the specific, socially productive way to do that. By providing a clear before and after state, these societies mitigated the ambiguity that causes so much friction in the modern world. A modern teenager lives in a state of partial adulthood for nearly a decade. They are physically capable of being adults at 15, but they aren't socially or economically allowed to be adults until their mid-20s. This creates a massive frustration gap, where the biological engine is screaming to go, but society has the parking brake pulled tight. Ancient teenagers didn't have that problem. Once they passed the ritual, they were adults. They had the status they craved, and with that status came the responsibility of the group's survival. The recklessness didn't vanish, but it was given a target. Instead of being reckless against the group, they were reckless for the group. They became the hunters who would take the extra step into the dark, the scouts who would cross the flooded river, the warriors who would stand their ground. They were still dangerous, but now that danger was pointed outward, toward the threats of the world, rather than inward, toward the stability of the family. So, were they dangerous to ancient humans? In a literal sense, yes. A teenager who made a mistake on a hunt could get people killed. A teenager who picked a fight with a neighboring tribe could start a war. But the alternative, a world without that reckless, pushing, questioning energy, would have been far more dangerous. A species that never takes risks is a species that eventually meets a challenge it isn't prepared for. Those ancient teenagers were the pioneers of our lineage. They were the ones who tried the weird berries that turned out to be medicinal. They were the ones who decided that maybe if they sharpened a rock in a different way, it would cut deeper. They were the ones who looked at the mountains and wondered what was on the other side, while the adults were busy making sure there was enough firewood for the night. We have inherited their brains. We are the descendants of the teenagers who survived their own bad ideas. When we see a teenager today doing something stupid for a TikTok video or pushing back against a perfectly reasonable rule, we aren't seeing a breakdown of modern society. We are seeing a biological relic. We are seeing a brain that is still trying to figure out how to be a hero in a world that mostly just wants it to sit still and follow instructions. We have removed the predators, we have automated the food supply, and we have made the world incredibly safe, but we haven't updated the software in the teenage head. It is still looking for a cave lion to track. It is still looking for a rite of passage. It is still looking for a way to prove that it is brave enough to lead the tribe into the unknown. The conflict between parents and teenagers is not a tragedy. It is a dialogue between the past and the future. The parent represents the wisdom of what has already worked, and the teenager represents the possibility of what might work better. We need both. If we only had the wisdom of the elders, we would still be living in caves, afraid of the dark. If we only had the recklessness of the teenagers, we would have gone extinct before we ever learned to control fire. The friction is the point. It is the heat that allows the species to forge something new. It's helpful to remember that when things feel the most tense, when that heavy sigh fills the room and the air feels thick with unspoken frustration, you aren't just a parent dealing with a difficult kid. You are a participant in a 40,000-year-old ritual. You are the anchor, and they are the sail. It is an uncomfortable, exhausting, and often terrifying arrangement, but it is the reason we are all here. The ancient world was a brutal, unforgiving place, and it had no room for wasted energy. If the reckless teenager was a part of that world, it was because they were essential. They were the ones who kept the story moving forward, even when the story was dangerous. The next time you see a teenager roll their eyes, or you hear that specific bored exhale, take a second to look past the modern clothes and the smartphone. Look at the way their body seems too big for the chair they're sitting in, the way their energy feels like it's vibrating against the walls of the house. That isn't attitude. That is a biological masterpiece designed for a world that no longer exists. It is the ghost of a hunter-gatherer trying to find a perimeter to guard. It is the restless, beautiful, and terrifying drive that took us from the savannah to the stars. We call it acting out, but in the deep history of our species, we called it survival. Think back to that opening image, the teenager at the table, the heavy sigh, the rhythmic exhale. It feels so small in the context of a modern kitchen. But imagine that same person 40,000 years ago, standing at the edge of the firelight. That same exhale isn't about a chores list or a forgotten homework assignment. It's the sound of someone who has just realized the adults don't have all the answers. It's the sound of a person deciding that tonight is the night they go out into the dark alone. That sigh is the sound of the guard changing. It's the sound of the old world losing its grip on the new one. It is a chilling, quiet signal that the person you raised is gone, replaced by someone who is willing to risk everything to see what's over the next hill. You can try to hold them back, you can try to keep them safe, and you can try to dampen that fire, but you are fighting against the very thing that made us human. In the end, the reckless teenager isn't the danger. The real danger is what happens to a world that stops listening to that sigh. It's a sound that has echoed through the millennia, and it's a sound that tells you, with terrifying certainty, that the future is no longer in your hands. It belongs to the person who is brave enough and foolish enough to step away from the fire. It's a lot to process the next time you're just trying to get someone to clean their room, but it's a perspective that changes the way you see the people around you. What do you think? Have you ever felt that ancient drive to just keep moving, even when it didn't make sense? Let me know in the comments, and if you found this deep dive into our biological history interesting, consider subscribing for more looks into the strange, hidden patterns that make us who we are. There's a lot more to our story than what we see on the surface.